Good afternoon. Dear Mrs. Jennifer Simon, President of the Simon Foundation Canada. Dear Mrs. Karen Hallberg, Chair of the Pugwash Conferences. His Excellency Ambassador Alexander Kmentt, dear distinguished speakers, dear participants online, ladies and gentlemen. It's a particularly honor for me to welcome you today at the Vienna School of International Studies, Diplomatische Akademie Wien, to the Simon's panel on prospects for nuclear disarmament. The Vienna School of International Studies, or Diplomatische Akademie, as we say here in Vienna, is a center of excellence for the study of international affairs and the oldest professional school in the world, having launched talented men and women into international careers and positions of leadership over the course of more than 2 centuries. We are proud, in fact, to celebrate this year our 270 years jubilee since the foundation of the Academy in 1754. Our unique multidisciplinary teaching approach, dedicated to the highest academic standards and linking theory to practice, are complemented by world-renowned executive training programs and public lectures and debates focusing on current themes. The topic of today's panel is again of actuality, which in that case I would say unfortunately. Nuclear disarmament is more than ever, I would say, necessary in a globalized world with growing tensions and in particular a war of aggression by Russia in Ukraine. The Diplomatische Akademie Wien is an attractive institution for renowned international researchers in the disarmament field. We were very happy, in fact, to welcome last year Professor Nina Tannenwald, Senior Lecturer from the Department of Political Science at the Brown University, as Fulbright Visiting Professor of International Relations to the DA, where she gave classes and a public lecture on the Russian war in Ukraine and the nuclear order. For those interested, her lecture was published and streamed online. You can still watch it online if you go on our website. The Diplomatische Akademie is also ideally located, as you have seen, as Vienna is the headquarters of multiple international organizations like the International Atomic Energy, the CTBTO, or the OSCE, which are of relevance in the disarmament field. We are particularly honored of having been chosen by Pugwash as host of their conference. Pugwash seeks a world free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. During the darkest days of the Cold War, the founders of Pugwash understood the danger of nuclear weapons. In their efforts to change dangerous policies, they became pioneers of a new kind of transnational track 2 dialogue. Through its long-standing tradition of dialogue across divides that earned also Pugwash the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995, Pugwash aims to develop and support the use of scientific, evidence-based policymaking, focusing on areas where nuclear and weapon of mass destruction risks are present. The Nobel Peace Prize 1995 was awarded jointly to Joseph Lodgaard and Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, and here I would like to quote, for their efforts to diminish the part played by nuclear arms in international politics and, in the long run, to eliminate such arms. Unfortunately, 29 years later, these arms are far to be eliminated. It is more necessary than ever to take stock on the prospects of nuclear disarmament and to discuss what options we have to improve the security in our world. I look forward to our discussion and I wish us all an interesting time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina, very much for your kind words. My name is Hallberg. I'm the chair of council, and I'm going to chair the rest of this discussion. But first of all, I would really like to thank the Diplomatische Akademie. I would like to thank Ambassador Kmentt and all the staff of the Academy. It has been an excellent venue. We've had our Pugwash Council meeting. It's a rare occasion where we can have an in-person meeting after so many meetings by Zoom. This has been really important because the discussions that can be and decisions that can be achieved by an in-person meeting are irreplaceable. So thank you very much for that, and it has been a really excellent venue. Thank you for everything. I would also like now to briefly introduce our council member, Jennifer Simons. Jennifer has been a long-lasting supporter of Pugwash, of the Pugwash Conferences for over a decade, over 12 years, I think, Jennifer, for that. So thank you so much for your long-lasting support. Jennifer is the founder and the president of the Simons Foundation Canada. Jennifer will start with the origin. This panel is organized by the Simons Foundation as an initiative of Jennifer. So it's the Simons panel on prospects for nuclear disarmament. So I completely agree with you, Martina, that this is one of the most relevant topics and catastrophic risks for humanity. So thank you very much, Jennifer.
And good afternoon. I'd like to add my welcome to Martina, Schubert, and Karen. And I'm most appreciative of the opportunity to say a few words about the current situation with which we're faced. We're in a time of utmost critical danger of a nuclear incident. The international world order is under threat. As the UN Secretary General says, nuclear risk has reached heights not since the Cold War. And much can be attributed to Russia's aggressive foreign policy, culminating in 2022 in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This has had immense consequences. President Putin's invasion is responsible for the enlargement and strengthening of NATO and is in part to be blamed for a potential new nuclear arms race. The Russian president has not calculated the dimension and extent of Ukraine's support as the Western allies overcame their reservations and are providing high-impact military aid and financial security assistance. Mutual reductions in nuclear arms between Russia and the US have stalled, and China is expanding its nuclear arsenal in order to reach parity with them. North Korea is advancing its nuclear programs and supplying Russia with weapons to attack Ukraine. Iran, too, is providing ballistic missiles to Russia for its war on Ukraine. Moreover, because of the U.S. withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran is increasing enrichment to weapon production level, and with Israel's war in Gaza between nuclear-armed Israel and Iran proxies, the situation could explode into nuclear war. The international realm is further destabilized because the United States now has the capacity with non-nuclear forces to preempt Russia and Chinese nuclear forces. U.S. conventional weapons are far superior in development to those of Russia and China and are capable of destroying all of China's and Russia's nuclear missile silos, a threat which could trigger a nuclear response. To compound all of this, Ukraine invaded Russia. Ukraine called President Putin's bluff, engendering an even more precarious nuclear security environment. Since its original nuclear deterrence blackmail, Russia has continued to raise the specter of escalating its war on Ukraine to nuclear use. By invading Russia, Ukraine has demonstrated that Russia cannot be allowed to dictate the terms of conflict by issuing nuclear threats. And this has placed more pressure on the Kremlin, raised the risk calculus, and created uncertainty with regard to Russia's bluff. To date, this has appeared to be empty rhetoric, with no open evidence of practical follow-through. But we can't count on this. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov and former President Dmitry Medvedev's threats may become reality. As Pavel Bev warns us, the task of deciphering Putin's risk calculus can never be accomplished with certainty. We desperately need diplomatic initiatives, not more nuclear or other weapons. Intensive diplomacy is needed to eliminate the risk of inadvertent war through deliberate use by Russia or by miscalculation or accident. This now provides me with the opportunity to introduce Ambassador Alexander Kmentt, our keynote speaker tonight, a man who actually needs no introduction because of his globally acknowledged outstanding leadership and invaluable contribution to a nuclear weapon-free future. As one of the architects of the humanitarian initiative, he dramatically reshaped diplomatic discussion on nuclear disarmament and the subsequent treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, and was the president of the first meeting of the state parties to the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Ambassador Kmentt is the Director of Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Department of the Austrian Foreign Ministry, and on behalf of the government spearheads Austria's leadership and actions in multilateralism with its focus on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and humanitarian disarmament initiatives. There is no better person to provide insight into essential furtherance of nuclear disarmament initiatives. And so I invite you, Alexander, to take the chair. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this very, very kind introduction. I was blushing a bit. And I have to say that two other architects of TPNW are also in the room. My predecessor, Ambassador Thomas Hanotzi, my colleague George Wilhelm Stahlhofer from the Foreign Ministry. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to speak today. I'm very glad to see you, Jennifer, Dr. Simons, back here in Vienna. And I also want to acknowledge your commitment to and support for nuclear disarmament. And I'm pleased to see so many very notable nuclear experts and members of Pugwash in Vienna. And we're pleased that the Pugwash Council meeting takes place here. From the Austrian Foreign Ministry side, we are pleased to have been supporting this meeting because we think that Pugwash as an organization, but also, if you wish, the business case for Pugwash is very, very strong again. And one has to add the word unfortunately to that. Pugwash is needed again due to the very disconcerting developments that we see in the nuclear field. Let me refer to something that I think is important for more people to know. Last April, the National Academy of Sciences of the G7 countries, which of course is the US, France, and the UK, 3 nuclear weapon states, as well as Japan, Germany, Italy, and Canada, issued a joint statement. And let me quote a few sentences of this. The joint statement says, I quote, "In the context of the current global instability, it is imperative to highlight the known consequences of nuclear warfare." And later on it says, I quote, "Among the roles of the scientific community are to continue to develop and communicate the scientific evidence base that shows the catastrophic effects of nuclear warfare on human populations and on the other species with which we share our planet, to develop means to monitor, detect, and verify agreements, and to support the governments as they seek to fulfill the commitments described above. The science academies of the G7 countries, in light of the rise of international tensions and wars, calls on the G7 leaders to once more reaffirm their commitment to achieving a world without nuclear weapons, and to take the steps necessary to help the world realize this goal safely and securely. So we were surprised to hear this from the G7 countries, because this is actually what Austria and the countries that have promoted the TPNW have been saying for years. So this call for the scientific community to get engaged in the nuclear debate again. It's a call to bring the evidence-based focus into a highly politicized global discourse on nuclear weapons. And it is a call to foster dialogue, enhance confidence, and of course all of this is crucially needed right now. So I'm convinced that the Pugwash movement can and must play a crucial role on these points. Dear colleagues, nowhere are the negative geopolitical trends more apparent than in the global nuclear disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation field. The nuclear debate is almost something like a geopolitical seismograph. And this field, and in particular when it comes to nuclear disarmament, is in a dismal state. The disarmament obligations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, are not implemented, and the disarmament commitments that have been agreed to by consensus in the past are ignored. And in light of so many developments that go in exactly the opposite direction, it's hard to discern any sign of progress in this direction, or even any intention towards it by the nuclear weapon states. So what is one to conclude, for example, from the fact that the annual global nuclear weapons spending has surged to more than $90 billion a year in 2023? These are long-term investments into modernization of nuclear weapons and the related infrastructure, and a clear demonstration of intent of long-term reliance on nuclear weapons and of extending nuclear arsenals into the distant future. This and decisions to increase capabilities of nuclear forces is happening in all nuclear weapon states. Moreover, some nuclear weapon states add new or additional types of nuclear weapons to their arsenals and improve the capability to produce them. Some have increased the readiness of nuclear forces. Nuclear doctrines are being broadened. We have seen the abandonment of nuclear agreements, and one state has removed the nuclear ban from its constitutions. We see the stationing of nuclear weapons in additional countries, and there are concerning plans to deploy new intermediate range missiles. Moreover, we are alarmed about nuclear threats and blackmail, such as Russia's implicit but unmistakable nuclear threats in the context of its illegal invasion of Ukraine. And more broadly, we're concerned of an increasingly strident nuclear rhetoric that risks to normalize the use of nuclear weapons. All these developments are gravely disconcerting and increase the high level of nuclear risks of conflict, which today is a real danger in several geopolitical and regional contexts. They also fundamentally undermine the NPT, of course. So when we talk about nuclear disarmament, what do we mean? From my perspective, it would mean A, actual reductions, removal and destructions of nuclear weapons. But B, and probably even more importantly, it would mean credible steps away from reliance on nuclear weapons and away from a security approach that is based on these weapons and on the threat of mass destruction and of indiscriminate nuclear violence through them. So as regards of reductions of nuclear weapons, bilateral nuclear arms control between the US and Russia has essentially come to a halt. So it's vital that both states do not let the New START Treaty expire in 2026 and return with urgency to nuclear arms control negotiations and a follow-on agreement. Of course, the US has proposed such talks with Russia and China, but regrettably that has not been taken up. But we think that all nuclear weapon states should be engaged in this process as soon as possible. And that was actually promised at the 2010 NPT Review Conference. But as far as steps away from reliance on nuclear weapons are concerned, there is literally nothing positive to see. only the above-cited developments pointing in exactly the opposite direction. Obviously, geopolitics drives these developments, but also the very entrenched belief by nuclear weapon states and nuclear-dependent states that nuclear deterrence provides security and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future. So for this to change, a fundamental paradigm shift on the security perception around nuclear weapons and around nuclear deterrence would be necessary. Nuclear deterrence is a high-risk approach to international security. Ambiguities and risk-taking are woven into the very fabric of nuclear deterrence. These risks are getting more and more pronounced by geopolitical tensions, by new and disruptive technologies, by proliferation pressures, and by the weakening of the legal normative framework for nuclear weapons. Consequently, there is no and never can be any assurance that nuclear deterrence will hold in any crisis situation. It is a fragile and precarious psychological construct. Miscalculations, misinformation, human and technical errors are always possible. The uncertain stability and security benefits of nuclear deterrence need to be weighed against the risks that are inherent in this strategy, and against the increasing body of scientific evidence about the catastrophic global impact that deterrence failure and nuclear weapons use would have. So this security approach creates acute threats and risks for the entire international community, including for those more than 150 states that have forsworn nuclear weapons. All of those would end up as collateral damage of a nuclear conflict in much more grave, catastrophic and complex ways than previously assumed. And of course, this raises profound questions about international legitimacy, international law, and international but also intergenerational justice. We all know that security cannot and should not be a zero-sum game. But for the vast majority of states and of peoples, nuclear weapons are the ultimate zero-sum game approach to security. Those who argue the value of nuclear weapons for their security should acknowledge the legitimate concern that this very approach creates to the rest of the international community. More importantly, they should engage with these concerns. We need to have an honest and inclusive conversations about this at the international level. This is urgent and it's necessary since this security approach based on nuclear deterrence by definition, as I said before, concerns the entire international community, given that the risks and consequences would be borne by us all. Also for Austria, this is not an abstract danger. I assume that most Austrians have no idea that nuclear weapons are stationed in a NATO basis in Italy, just a few kilometers south of the border. If nuclear deterrence would ever fail and nuclear weapons were to be used in Europe, this would of course be one of the first targets. It is naive to trust that this will never happen. And it's naive to think that this would not have catastrophic consequences, also for this country. Yet most in the public seems to be unaware or unconcerned about this, or of the global high level of nuclear risk. And maybe we are programmed that way, that we rather not think about things like that. However, leadership towards a paradigm shift on nuclear weapons is simply not coming from the states that possess these weapons. They are either not willing or not able to extract themselves from the security deterrence paradigm. The belief in the ultimate security guarantee of nuclear weapons is too deeply entrenched. It looks almost like a dogma that must not be challenged. Moreover, proponents of nuclear weapons have been rather successful in claiming realism as the basis for the nuclear deterrence security paradigm, while portraying the pursuit of nuclear abolition and nuclear disarmament as idealist, as unrealistic, or as naive. And this also needs to change. And the increasing body of scientific evidence about the magnitude and complexity of humanitarian consequences and mounting and complex risks associated with nuclear weapons challenges claims of nuclear deterrence stability. Dear colleagues, some of these points are the rationale and are the arguments on which the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, is based, that Austria is one of the key supporters. The treaty encapsulates and expresses in international law this scientific evidence on the humanitarian and environmental consequences and on the risks associated with these weapons. And it articulates a legitimate and a cogent security perspective. The TPNW has a legal dimension and a political dimension. We hope, and we are working for it, that more states will join the treaty and thus strengthen the legal and normative rejection of nuclear weapons. However, equally important is the political side. Using opportunities of challenging the precarious logic of nuclear deterrence by highlighting the science and the facts on the consequences and risks of nuclear weapons if something goes wrong. I'm convinced of the importance of engagement with the scientific evidence on the consequences and risks, because this evidence leads to urgent, I think it leads inescapably to urgent policy conclusions and points the way out of the ultimately unsustainable security paradigm that is based on the threat of mass destruction. And science and scientists will have a key role to play in this. Leadership for the much-needed paradigm shift on nuclear weapons is therefore coming from the non-nuclear majority of states and civil society, those that are working on and in the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So I conclude by saying that we need a much broader societal and multi-stakeholder discourse on this truly existential issue. The security policy expert community, with no offense to anybody in the room, but this security policy expert community alone is unlikely to find a solution because we have tried and mostly failed for the last 8 decades. All the vectors seem to point in the direction of more reliance on nuclear weapons and higher nuclear risks. Speaking out for nuclear disarmament may seem like a hopeless task, however, exactly against this negative backdrop, it is ever so important. Thank you for your attention.
Ambassador Kmentt, thank you very much for this deep, honest, and complete assessment and reflections on the current situation, and this is what joins us here as Pugwash too. So thank you very much. We resonate with all your words. So now I would like to introduce our panel today. So we have 3 distinguished speakers in the order we have here in the program. So we have Sverre Lodgaard. Sverre is a member of the Pugwash Council, and he's also a member of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Let me just introduce all of the panel speakers, and then we begin with the panel. We also have Steve Miller. He's also a council member, a Pugwash Council member. He's at the Belfast Center at Harvard University. And also Tariq Rauf. Tariq is from Pugwash, Canada. He's a former head of verification and security policy of the IAEA, and also a brand new member of the Pugwash Council. So welcome, Tariq. So thank you very much for being here. And then the idea is then if you can express your ideas and your talk for about 15 minutes, and then we will open a discussion of a couple of minutes with questions from the public. So Sverre, you are first on the list.
Thank you so much, Karen. Good to see you all. And it has been a special pleasure to reunite with good Austrian friends. Thank you for being here. Let me start by giving a synopsis of what I have in mind to say, the topics I would address. Arms control was instrumental to a world that no longer exists, calling for stabilization in order to avoid a war that nobody wanted. Today, revisionist powers defy stability. Revisionist powers both in Europe and in Asia. And in the United States and Russia, war-fighting planning includes conventional, nuclear, and other means. There's much to suggest that China is moving in the same direction, but we do not know much or enough about that to say with certainty. Nuclear warfighting doctrines are variations of flexible response and first-use policies to hook on to some notions that are familiar to all of you. The indicators that we are moving in that direction are several. Counter-force targeting and big numbers of warheads have been parts of U.S. and Soviet/Russian planning for a long time, also for other reasons than nuclear warfighting. High speed, increased accuracy is important in order to be able to destroy high-value time-urgent targets, such as missiles before they are launched, aircraft before takeoff, submarines while still in port. Dual-use delivery vehicles, variable yield warheads add flexibility to the operations. And high C-cubed facilities also do that. C-cubed facilities that can handle both nuclear and conventional munitions. Sometimes new low-yield warheads are strong indicators of warfighting preparations. For instance, the American F-35 aircraft has warheads of the yield of 0.3 and 1.5 at the low end, then increasing up to 10 and 50. In the process, escalation ladders are compressed and decision times are shortened. We know quite a bit about U.S. and Russian planning, so I will not dwell on that, but we shall certainly get to know more in the time ahead. We have all followed Russian, more or less veiled threats of nuclear use in Europe. There are reports indicating that Russia is now contemplating amendments to their nuclear doctrine. We shall follow that. Presumably, we will also get to know more about the American nuclear guidance document that President Biden signed in March of this year. But the intriguing point here is China. Whether China would follow suit and also develop warfighting plans. So far, or for a long time, China was thinking that if the nuclear threshold would be crossed, then Armageddon would follow. So they didn't care to plan for limited nuclear use. And that is what may be about to change. But so far, China sticks to the no first use doctrine. At any time and under any circumstance as it goes. But two questions raise doubts about the realism of that declaration. The one being, in case Chinese nuclear forces would be attacked by conventional means, and if China would face conventional defeat that greatly threatens its survival, then it may be the first to use nuclear weapons. Just recently, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute said that China has uploaded a small number of nuclear weapons onto the delivery vehicles, that is to say, in normal times of peace, not as a part of drills or military exercises, high readiness exercises. And that does not square very well with the no first use promise, which, however, China maintains very strongly, also for political, or not least for political reasons. The nuclear notebook, a source well known to all of you through the bulletin of the atomic scientists and also through Sipri, recently referred to a serious central Chinese source which spoke about organic integration of nuclear counterattack capability and conventional strike capability, meaning that preparations for limited nuclear use is integrated with the offense-dominated approach to conventional warfare. In terms of hardware, there is much to build on, also for China. Uppermost on that list is the DF-26 missile, dual-capable missile. But there's also the DF-21 road mobile missile. And new low-yield warheads have been hypothesized for a long while, both for the DF-26 and for the boost glide DF-17 supersonic. But we have no confirmation of that as of yet. Especially the DF-26 is catching a lot of attention in this connection, but there is, in other words, a broader range of systems that China can build on. Therefore, as I said, there is much to suggest that China is about to make contingency plans for nuclear use, limited nuclear use. But Western strategists should be careful not to mirror image their own thinking onto Chinese strategists, because China might find its own way of invoking nuclear weapons and sort of all-out nuclear warfare. So what does that, where does that lead me? It leaves me with the contours of two thresholds. The traditional nuclear threshold from conventional to nuclear, and then further down the road, one more threshold at which the limited use of nuclear weapons might be contained and reversed. And to the extent that people begin to think that it would be possible to stop nuclear warfare short of all-out nuclear war, well, it follows that that would lower the traditional nuclear threshold from conventional to nuclear. Actors might be more willing to take risks if they believe that limited war, nuclear war, would after all be could after all be limited and reversed. So that leads me to a series of practical, or maybe not practical, but concrete suggestions on how to react to this development. And my first point on that list is highlighting the results of NATO exercises involving the use of nuclear weapons. I have seen the reports from just a few such exercises, but the lessons there have been that once you start to use nuclear weapons, escalation follows and control is lost. People who have been privy to many more exercises, and maybe the universe even of exercises, confirm that lesson. They are saying that invariably it ends that way. Control is lost. So that is a powerful warning to those who begin to believe that nuclear weapons can be used, but in a limited way. Risk reduction measures is my second point. Risk reduction, it is called for more than maybe at any time before. But as long as the war in Ukraine is going on, it is anathema in Europe. In East Asia, it is indeed important, but there it seems that high-risk undertakings, incidents, sometimes happen for a reason. Such incidents being part of the power game. So if I see China as sometimes being interested in talking to the United States about risk reduction, in other connections, in other cases not. It's a bit on and off. The talks are on and off, and for the time being, I think they are off. But China is also using this as a matter of signaling. But certainly for China, these matters are part of the power game of trying to push the United States as far away from Chinese shores as possible. Still, we have to work on that, and it is in everybody's lips that we have to be conscious of any opportunity that pops up to undertake risk reduction measures. Third, the United States and Russia recognized mutual vulnerability, mutually assured destruction. That has not happened in relation to China. And you can wonder why. Is it because the Americans believe they can get something in return? Is it because they believe so much in their superior technologies that they find it unnecessary to do the same with China as they have done with Russia? Is it because they deem it beneficial to keep China in a state of uncertainty? Is it because of bureaucratic inertia? I don't know. But what I think I know is that if the United States would be willing to recognize China the way it has recognized Russia, then that would put the two big states on the same status. And that, I suggest, would be beneficial, would be conducive to cooperation. The next point, I'll make that my final point, has to do with common security. The Palme Commission from 1992 approach which says, in the nuclear age, security is not something you can build alone by unilateral rearmament. Security is something you have to build together with your adversary. Interestingly, in 2014, Xi Jinping, in a speech before a conference on confidence building in Asia, spoke about common security. He was not using that word. The Chinese rather prefer win-win. But the wording, the sentences, were almost taken straight from the Common Security Report of 1992. Xi Jinping should be credited for that. But today, the world is miles away from that standard, maybe further away from that standard than at any time since arms control was first introduced in the 1960s. Still, the common security approach has it right. So we have to stick I suggest to that approach, common security. However, uphill, that fight would be, simply because it contains some hard truth. So let us hold on to that and remember that as we are trying to walk our way through this very difficult period. I have some more points on my list, but I think I should stop there. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Perfect timing, Sverre. Thank you very much for your deep insights too. So here we can open the floor for some discussion, comments. We have a couple of minutes for this. I think it would be good to exchange ideas or proposals, criticisms, solutions. Of course, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Sverre, for that wide spectrum of coverage, but I was also hoping you might refer to a fellow Norwegian, the Brundtland Report, and I was wondering whether you might want to say something about that as well, which also relates to common. There have been many of them. Which do you have in mind? The original Brundtland Report from 88, Sustainable Development. My first comment would be take sustainable development seriously also in the military field, with military activities and military build-ups. Right now, I think it's fair to say that there's a huge gap there, although the militaries here and there are, of course, aware of the problem, and they pay lip service to it, but not much more than that.
Yes, Francesco.
The scientific community has taken an initiative, a very wide initiative, to support no-first use. And which are, in your opinion, the possibility of accepting this policy by all nuclear states? By all nuclear states, that's a very tall order. But let me emphasize the following. There are two big powers which I committed to no first use, namely China and India. India with a couple of modifications. They say nuclear weapons are there also to deter chemical and biological weapons since 2003. So why don't they collude and declare in common, the two of them, that they stand for no first use? And that immediately then meets the problem that China does not recognize India as a nuclear weapon state. That leads me to say that I wonder what China tries to achieve in not reading the world as it is. That goes, of course, also for Pakistan and for Israel, for North Korea, and they are not recognized. Well, Israel doesn't admit to it either. But with a little bit of visionary thinking, if the Chinese were willing to recognize that India is indeed a nuclear weapon state, then there could be a joint statement by the two of them, and that could lead to something more. But when you consider Pakistan's situation and the Russian situation, then this becomes very, very clear. In other words, in 2010, Obama's nuclear posture review extended unconditional negative security assurances to all states in good standing with the NPT, and it said that this is as far as we got this time, but we will work to establish the objective conditions for a transition to no first use. That was about the last constructive message, however, that we get from the Obama
administration, because later on the initial hopeful proposals seem to have been forgotten.
So here I have, yes. Thomas, if you allow me to.
Thank you, Sverre. It was wonderful to listen to you, as it always has been. What we have seen over the last 2-3 years is a revival of the no first use idea. And I think some people are not always speaking about the same things. So for some people it's just a declaratory matter. But to give it some credibility, of course, you would need very concrete facts. So for example, tactical nuclear weapons do not make sense for other purposes than first use. So they would be out. You would have to adapt your nuclear doctrine, certainly. You might have further restraints. You would have to have have limitation of the level of nuclear weapons and so on and so on. So, in my view, this is very important for the credibility, and that this concept would be a successful pathway towards nuclear disarmament. So now comes the $1 million question. Do you see any chance that this could happen in our lifetime? Thank you.
It is, you are quite right. To be credible, the declarations have to be matched by specific Hallberg preparations. And it could be possible, when looking at the posture, at the systems overall, it must be possible to read out of what we get to know that the early use of nuclear weapons are not being prepared. We had that discussion during the Cold War in 1981-82 when the Soviet Union declared no first use, but we couldn't see any implication of that for their postures. And it was judged not credible for good reason. But it is with this proposition, as with many other propositions, the difficulties seem not possible to overcome. But we have to press on. And it was in that spirit I mentioned the two Asian powers, India and Pakistan. Maybe something could begin there, since they are already committed unilaterally to no first use. I'm afraid, though, that circumstances have dictated or pressed the Chinese, as you understand, to go the other way, to prepare for nuclear war fighting. And if you begin to think about scenarios that might evolve over the issue of Taiwan, you easily see that a situation could evolve where China, trying to use impressive conventional forces to pull Taiwan in, would be met with the United States and allies willing to use nuclear weapons in order to prevent that. And for China then not to be prepared for that eventuality, it doesn't quite fit. So most of what I've seen indicate that China is also preparing for limited nuclear war, options for limited nuclear war. But true to their tradition, they may find their own ways of, as I said, invoking nuclear weapons while trying to limit the worker sort of all-out nuclear war.
Thank you, Sverre. I propose that we continue, and then at the end, we can have an overall round of discussion again once we listen to the three speakers, if you agree. So, Steve, please.
Thank you, Karen.
let me add my thanks to our host at the Diplomatic Academy. It's been a lovely place to have our meeting. I should also say that it's an honor to be a part of the Simon's Symposium. Thank you very much. I'm sensing this is not going to be an upbeat panel. Some of what I wanted to say has been anticipated by several speakers who preceded me. By agreement, my topic was the transformation of the nuclear order. And so I'll try to sketch very quickly a framework that tries to pull together a number of these threads, including some that have been already mentioned very eloquently in the earlier remarks. But to understand how much has changed, we have to take a moment to reflect on where we started. And if you go back to the early 90s, we were living in what H.W. Bush dubbed the New World Order. This New World Order was going to be built on a U.S.-Russia strategic partnership. The American foreign policy elite had hopes that China could be seduced into being what was known as a responsible stakeholder in the existing international order. There were visions of a nuclear future in which lower and lower numbers of nuclear weapons would be more and more governed by various regulatory mechanisms, arms control agreements, reciprocal arrangements, and so on. That's the vision that existed in those days. It was a hopeful time. And when we look back on it from a distance of several decades, what it appears is that we have squandered an enormous opportunity to somehow construct a more durable and benign international environment. And where are we today? Well, I'm going to make points under 5 headlines. And the first is obvious, but it's the wider canvas on which we're operating. What we've seen with a vengeance is the restoration of great power competition. But it's not a restoration of the familiar simplicities of the bilateral Cold War world. It's now a triangular relationship which will be much more complicated and difficult to manage. We have high levels of toxicity between Washington and Moscow, between Washington and Beijing. We see conflict, we see use of force, we see nuclear threats. This is a ballgame that is so far removed from the hopes of the early 1990s that it really represents a kind of stunning transformation, and I would say a stunning failure of our statesmanship. That somehow we must have made some very large mistakes to move from where we were to where we are, just in the political realm. Now, as the political situation in the globe is increasingly marked by great power friction and rivalry, this unfortunately coincides with vigorous nuclear modernization programs almost across the board in all the nuclear weapon states. We've heard a bit about that already, but particularly among the 3 big powers. The United States is presently engaged in a comprehensive 30-year nuclear modernization program aimed at producing the nuclear force for 2050, and the aggregate cost of this is approaching $2 trillion. That's trillion with a T. In response to the revelations about the expansion of China's capabilities, expectations that it will have a much larger force for the first time in its nuclear history, there's a growing consensus in Washington that this modernization program, which is known as the Plan of Record, is now viewed as too small and too slow. And the hawks in Washington are already wandering around saying, it's too late. It's too late for us to respond effectively to the Chinese buildup. We need an emergency modernization program that will hasten this modernization. So every element of the American nuclear force posture is being modernized and improved. We're investing tens of billions of dollars to revive and expand our ability to produce
nuclear weapons. There is a congressionally mandated goal now that the United States should have the ability to produce 80 new warheads per year. This is now being criticized as woefully inadequate in the face of the Chinese challenge. But the Russians are in the midst of a vigorous modernization program. The Chinese modernization, as I mentioned, is catalyzing Washington to rethink our posture. And so modernization is happening, and as Alexander rightly says, these are systems that are expected to have lifetimes that are measured in decades. And if you map forward from 2050, what we're really doing now is investing in assets that are likely to be with us to the end of this century, in much the way that you hear frequently about how the B-52s go back to the 1950s. So, toxic politics intersecting with strategic modernization in ways that are going to haunt us for decades to come and produce, I think, a much more nuclearized environment in the future than the one we've witnessed in the recent past. The third headline is that all of this is happening in a very dynamic technological environment. I don't like this phrase emerging technologies because nobody can really define it, and most of the technologies that we're talking about have their roots years or decades in the past. But technological dynamism has the potential to undermine stability, to alter confidence and the robustness of our deterrence force, to introduce new dimensions of competition. Some of this, as mentioned by Sverre, has to do with improvements in existing capabilities like accuracy or surveillance. Some of it has to do with the embrace, in a sense, of technologies that have been around a long time but were set aside because they were not necessary, they were not cost-effective. But things like hypersonics, fractional orbital bombardment systems, ASAT, and so on. Nothing new about these, but they're now being tested, they're being invested in, and they're being contemplated as elements of future postures. So what we're getting is a whole set of new technological suites that will be locked into our postures for decades to come. And some of these advanced technologies in the areas of cyber and AI and so on will be very, very difficult to control with arms control, and may also make it more difficult to control the kinds of things that we were able to control in the past. So we have toxic politics intersecting with modernization at a moment when fast movement of technology is dislocating our expectations about future postures, whereas in the past we had a very comfortable portfolio of technologies that everybody was comfortable with. This is changing. That leads to the fourth headline, which again has been anticipated, but it's an obvious one in a room like this with a panel like this. The demise of arms control. In the United States, there are those who argue arms control is dead. There are those that argue arms control is dying. There's nobody who argues that it's anything other than dormant. Those of us who are arms control advocates hope that it's dormant and we can revive it at some point in the future. But 3 decades of strenuous investment in arms control, strategic arms control, nuclear arms control, from the 1960s to the year 2000, basically have been largely dismantled. There are many lesser measures and less famous agreements that are still on the books, but these are all ignored or neglected or violated at will. The only remaining significant strategic arms control agreement is New START. It expires on February 4th, 2026. At the moment, there's not a single indication of any effort on either side to find a replacement for this treaty. And I think it's highly likely that we are heading in to the most unregulated, unconstrained nuclear environment that we will have witnessed since the original nuclear agreements were achieved in 1972. And since we're sitting here in the middle of Europe, it's perhaps worth also noting that the European security architecture lies in ruins. Right? It wasn't so long ago, if you went on the OSCE website, there were 4 pillars of the European security order. The Helsinki Principles, 10 principles. INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, CFE, Conventional Forces, and Open Skies, which provided transparency. Well, the 10 Helsinki principles have been universally shattered by the events we've witnessed over the past couple of years. I believe it's safe to say that all 10 of the 10 Helsinki principles have been violated. And the other three pillars no longer exist. And in two of the cases, it was the United States that withdrew from the treaty and ruined the existing regimes that existed. So we are now looking at a future where much of the architecture that had been built no longer exists. There's little will, I would say, in any country, relevant country, including my own, to find our way back to arms control. The predominant view in the United States is that arms control is a failed experiment, an obsolete relic of the Cold War. What this means is that you have toxic politics intersecting with modernization in a very dynamic technological environment with very few negotiated constraints to structure and order the competition. And then the last big change that I see, this is headline number 5, has to do with proliferation. And in the early 1990s, the regional nuclear balances that we now have to worry about in South Asia and Northeast Asia literally did not exist. And now we have 2 nuclearized regions and 1 partially nuclearized region in the Middle East where we have to worry about the stability of the security, the prudence and restraint in these regional settings. And this has produced what I sometimes describe as a new nuclear geography. You have a core triangle, which is Russia, China, the United States. You have the South Asian triangle, which is China, Pakistan, India. You have the Northeast Asian quadrilateral, which is Russia, China, the United States, and North Korea. And there we have a little footnote, which is we have 2 nuclear protected states in Japan and South Korea, which are under the American nuclear umbrella. And then we have in the Middle East the U.S., Israel, Iran triangle, where Iran is not yet a full-blown nuclear weapon state, but it's a latent nuclear weapon state. There's not the slightest doubt that when Iran decides to have nuclear weapons, it will get them unless somebody stops them from doing it. And these are interconnected geometries, which produces ripple effects. And you can easily imagine these chains where the Americans respond to the Chinese respond to the Americans, the Indians respond to the Chinese, the Pakistanis respond to the Indians. And so decisions taken in Washington can ripple almost through the entire system, or vice versa. And this, I think, makes for a much more unruly, difficult to manage international nuclear order. Now, I wish I could conclude by telling you that this is my interpretation. And I'm very sorry to report that it's not my interpretation. It's a description. This is a description of the world we're now living in. Everything I've described to you has happened or is happening. So I very much agree with Alexander's point that citizens around the world have to be more attentive to the world that their leaders are creating for them. That seems like a pretty potent point. It seems to me we have a crying need for sane and sensible voices. And I think that that's one of the aspirations we have for Pugwash, that it can be one of these venues within which people who have more sane and sensible approaches to the creation of security and the management of nuclear dangers can make their voices heard and have some impact or at least input into the policy realms that we hope to influence. We need in this world advocates of prudence and restraint. What we have today is the voices of fear and security expansion. The voices of prudence and restraint are losing nearly every battle, certainly in the United States. And ultimately what we need is to mobilize those people who are capable of rethinking in a serious way how states can find more effective ways, less dangerous ways, of achieving their profound interest in securing themselves. Many states seem to have convinced themselves that nuclear weapons are the way to do this, but there has to be some way of persuading people otherwise. And to me, this is why I'm involved in Pugwash. This is what I think Pugwash is committed to working on, and we do our best to raise our voices in ways that, for the moment, are counter the trends of the world in which we're living.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for this complete analysis. I like your comparison with geometry and physics. That was great, and mathematics.
That's about as sophisticated as I get.
Yes. This is where I began to understand it in sophistication. Let's say the floor is open for discussion. Yes, please.
Good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Aurora Weiss, and 2 days ago I announced my candidacy for the president of Croatia. Of course, I need to thank Mr. Kmentt very much for introducing me a few years ago this interesting topic about the nuclear disarmament. And of course, I decided always to contribute for nuclear disarmament. So my following question would be actually, we were talking about Iran. So my question is, are you really sure that they don't already have a nuclear weapon? The second point is about, let's talk about the nuclear armament of Israel and how dangerous would be this conflict between actually Israel and Iran, or we can just see it as something which is unrealistic. And I have actually the third point is when I was talking with the international community about the nuclear disarmament and how important that is, actually everybody was pointing one thing. They said, no, it's important nuclear armament because Ukraine gave up their weapons and look at what happened to them. So I just want to be quite realistic in this current situation between the Ukraine and Russia and how it actually gave another insight in the nuclear disarmament and also the nuclear armament situation in the moment in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, please.
So, on Iran, of course, you can never be 100% certain of a negative. But what we know is that Iran is, by a very wide margin, the most heavily inspected party in the history of the IAEA. We have one of the world's leading experts here in Royal Rockridge. If I'm wrong, she'll correct me. She won't be bashful about it. But it's not only that. Iran has been subject to extraordinary scrutiny by Western and American and Israeli intelligence. We know that Iran's nuclear program has been penetrated by agents, so we've had leakage from inside the program. If I had to bet a nickel, I'd bet that Iran does not presently have nuclear weapons. But they've already surpassed the most difficult challenge in manufacturing nuclear weapons, which is producing fissile materials. And once you've done that, I mean, what people often forget is that nuclear weapons are 1930s science and 1940s technology. Iran can do it and will do it if they make the decision, just as every other nuclear armed state has done. Israel has been an unacknowledged by itself nuclear weapon state, arguably as far back as 1970 or something or thereabouts. Israel has a very acute sense of its own insecurity. It has a deep belief, validated by some evidence, that it's surrounded by hostile parties. and it has seen this unacknowledged nuclear weapon program as an ultimate guarantor of Israeli security in a world where they see many of their enemies committed to throwing them into the sea. And if you've ever been to Israel, you know that in 35 minutes you can drive from Herzliya to Ramallah, right? I mean, it's not like Israel has strategic depth. So now Israel has been in a posture of enjoying and hoping to preserve the situation in which they are the only nuclear armed state in the Middle East. But they have at least contributed to nuclear interests in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran. So it isn't the case that there's been no reaction to Israel's nuclear weapons. It's that so far no one has succeeded. That may change with Iran. And then the question is, just as in South Asia and just as in Northeast Asia, what elements of stability can be introduced into a bilateral Israeli-Iranian nuclear deterrent relationship? That's the world we have to live in. We have to hope that it's stable. As in South Asia, many of the factors that were thought to be conducive to stability in the superpower relationship do not exist in the Middle East. And so this will be a very worrisome circumstance. With respect to Ukraine, there is this casual comment that one hears often that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons and look what happened to them. And there are several complications that I think need to be taken into account. Number one is that Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. Ukraine had nuclear weapons stationed on its territory over which it had no operational control and to which it had no ownership access. And they never had their hands on the command and control of those weapons. So it's not like they gave up on Ukrainian nuclear program. What they failed to do was seize and try to convert Soviet nuclear weapons for their own purposes. The second point is there was strong will in Moscow with a fair amount of sympathy in Washington for the proposition that those weapons, one way or another, were coming out of Ukraine. And I believe that we could easily have seen the use of force much earlier against Ukraine if they had attempted to take control of the nuclear assets on their territory. Those assets were in Russian hands. The Russians knew exactly where they were, and the Russians had inherited the most coherent part of Soviet military. The Ukrainians eventually could have generated some force, but not so strongly in the early 90s. So I think it would have not been a happy scenario for Ukraine. But there's a last element that people leave out, which is the United States and the West and NATO and EU were profoundly opposed to the appearance of more than one nuclear successor state in the former Soviet Union. And James Baker in December of 1991 did a tour of the former Soviet republic. And the message was, you can keep your nukes or you can have recognition by the West, but you can't have both. Well, these were new fragile states. Most of them wanted to join the West, including Ukraine. This made the nuclear decision for them a grand strategic choice, because you were going to be isolated, you were going to be unrecognized, you were going to have no support whatsoever, you were going to be economically bereft. What choice did these states have but to give up their nuclear weapons? And they would have paid a very high price had they not done otherwise. So I personally think it's a little bit facile to say, well, if only Ukraine had given up its weapons, it wouldn't be in trouble today. If it hadn't given up its nuclear weapons, it would have been in trouble then. So that's my answer to that one.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Let's continue. I think we should continue because and then we have a general discussion towards the end. Yes, so thank you for waiting, Jan. So, Tariq, please, we listen to you.
Thank you, Karen. And I'm pleased to join my two distinguished panelists, Sverre Lodgaard and Steve Miller. Now, even though under the bold leadership of Ambassador Alexander Kmentt, Austria has been punching well above its weight in international fora on nuclear disarmament, panel discussions like this, specifically on nuclear disarmament, still are few and far between in Vienna, and I think we need to have more of them. And I would also like to thank Dr. Martina Schubert, Deputy Director of the Vienna School of International Studies, for hosting us here at the Vienna Diplomatic Academy. And I also thank you, Karen, Chair of the Pugwash Council, and I'm happy to join you on the council.
Welcome.
Thank you. And as Dr. Simon pointed out, Pugwash Conferences got the Nobel Prize in 1995, but Pugwash actually is a small village in Nova Scotia, and the very first conference was hosted there by a Canadian philanthropist, Cyrus Eaton, who was born in Pugwash. So, Karen, as a Canadian, I'm a little bit grieved that on the website of Pugwash it says Cyrus Eaton was an American philanthropist. So, hopefully this can be corrected. We feel quite sensitive about these things sometimes.
Well taken. Thank you.
I know. So, about time it's, things change.
Canada is also part of America. I'm Argentinian, but I'm also America.
Yeah, but no, we don't accept the Americanization of the continent as such, the United States.
It's well taken. Thank you, Tariq.
I'm also grateful to my fellow Canadian, Dr. Jennifer Simons, President of the Simons Foundation, for generously supporting this. What you may not know is that Dr. Simons is the recipient of the highest civil award in Canada, which is the Order of Canada. And she also has 2 Queen Elizabeth medals for her philanthropic work. The Simons Foundation is the largest funder of civil society working on disarmament issues in Canada. And unfortunately, Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian Foreign Ministry, is not providing any funding there. And I'll take this opportunity to mention that in addition to Canadian Pugwash, I'm also a director of a small NGO registered in Canada called Atomic Reporters, which is operating here in Austria, registered with the Austrian Foreign Ministry. And we have received some funding from Alexander, but our largest funder lost his funding. So Atomic Reporters lost its funding. And so for a year now, the voice of Atomic Reporters in Vienna has been completely silenced. And I think this is a little bit of a loss, and so hopefully we can recoup this situation at some point. Now, you might also, some of you would know, but some of you might not know that in 2021, the Simons Foundation Award for Distinguished Global Leadership in the Service of Peace and Disarmament was awarded to none other than Alexander. And I will read the citation that Jennifer read out. For his role as one of the architects and the engineer of both the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, which dramatically reshaped diplomatic discussions on nuclear disarmament and the subsequent treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Now, for the award, she presented him with an exquisite piece of crystal glass, which was blue and white. This was a special sculpture provided by Susan Point of the Musqueam Coast Polish Nation, which hosts the city of Vancouver on its traditional lands. And it is in the form of a shaper, and for the indigenous people on the west coast of Canada, the Thunderbird is a very important mythical figure. And I will not describe the details of the prize so much, but other than to point out that the opening remarks given by the shaper of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons and the renewed emphasis on humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons is still very much an ongoing theme for us. And in 2015, and I'm sure Alexander will be blushing even more now, he got more votes than the Pope to get the Arms Control Association Award for Person of the Year. And also, just lastly on that, Alexander is now used to my acerbic comments on many issues, but I'm also a voluntary promoter of Alexander's book, which I brought with me here, which you can buy, and I'm sure he would be happy to sign it for you. You can invite him for a cup of coffee to Café Central, which is right at the back of the Austrian Foreign Ministry. And taking sort of advantage of that, I'll also promote this book, which was published by CIPRI by the former president of Pugwash, the late Ambassador Jana Pala, and myself. And this is a free book, which you can download on the web, called Reflections on the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. So now coming to the subject of this panel discussion. Yesterday I came across the third draft of the
text which is being negotiated for the Summit of the Future document, and this Summit for the Future will be held on the 22nd and the 23rd of September. Now, the first mention of disarmament comes way down in paragraph 47. And it seems that 5 nuclear weapon states are negotiating with the new Agenda Coalition states to work on this language on disarmament. And I was sort of, in a sense, concerned to read this, and I will read this. Recommit to the goal of total elimination of nuclear weapons in the context of general and complete disarmament and restrict and effective international control. So we're no better off if we get this language in the Summit of the Future. This is actually a regression. We already agreed in 2000 on unequivocal commitment to disarmament, and we broke the link with general and complete disarmament. So here again, Alexander, I'm looking at you and George Wilhelm and your Alexander Marcik in New York to see if you can fight to improve this language. And I was also concerned that in this entire document there is no mention at all of the first and the most important international organization here in Vienna, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and its work on nuclear verification and peaceful uses. Neither is there any mention of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. So yesterday I was in touch with the bosses of both of those organizations, and I got an explanation that they have been trying very hard, but there has been very strong pushback in the negotiations. So if we have a document coming out of this so-called Summit of the Future that is direct of recognition of these important issues, then I think this is a waste of time. And I don't know why we would be giving much credence to what comes out of this Summit for the Future. So it's not a very positive comment, unfortunately. But I think under the times, to supplement what both Sverre and Steve said, we not only have a regression in what we have achieved, but we are also not making any progress at all. So as you know, the last NPT review conference in August of 2022 and the last 2 sessions of the preparatory committee this year and last year could not agree on any outcome document. So we had nearly 50 days of negotiations, and there was pushback from the nuclear weapon states and their allied states. No acceptance of any benchmarks or any timelines. Previous benchmarks or timelines that were agreed are not honored. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is still languishing. In the past, we had 8 countries whose signature and ratification were required. Now, with Russia's de-ratification last year, we have 9. We hear in the news that there is activity going on at the 3 nuclear test sites in Lopnor, in Novaya Zemlya, and in Nevada. And I'm very surprised that the CTBTO is not asking for transparency visits. I have made this suggestion, but it really didn't garner any particular support. But I would urge state parties to the CTBT to ask for such transparency visits to ensure that actually there isn't preparations going on for resuming nuclear weapons testing. And here I'm pleased to acknowledge Martin Kalinowski in the audience, who is one of the world's leading experts on noble gases that are released as a result of nuclear detonations, krypton and xenon, among others. So thank you for coming here, Martin. Now, last year and before that, there was a lot of buzz about this movie on the biography of Robert Oppenheimer entitled American Prometheus. And while it talked a lot about his life, fortunately it spared us the horrors of the 2 uses of nuclear weapons over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the point I wanted to make here is that Leo Szilard, who was one of the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project, made the point that Truman really didn't understand what nuclear weapons had brought in terms of the military revolution. And my point in my submission is that even today, the leaders of the countries, the 9 that possess nuclear weapons and also those that rely on their defense arrangements anchored in nuclear weapons, also do not understand the implications of nuclear weapons. And I personally am very concerned that we are now on a slow march to a nuclear war. step by step, various red lines and thresholds are being crossed, and eventually there will be a horrible mistake, just as we found on the 22nd of February and then earlier also in 2014. And there are no sane voices calling for a cessation of hostilities, neither in the Ukraine war nor in the genocide that is going on in Gaza. And every day new weapons are being shipped to both of these war theaters. The defense industries are reaping enormous profits. Now there are contracts for the next decade or the next 2 decades. And what is the new government of the United Kingdom facing? Keith Starmer, a Labour government. He is going to cut the subsidy for pensioners to get money for heating their homes in the dead of winter. So, Alexander, those are also some of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. We don't really need to look only at the survivors of nuclear detonations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki or of the nuclear testing in the various sites, but today, in several of the nuclear weapon states, there are daily consequences of nuclear weapons. In Steve's country, unfortunately, there's also crumbling infrastructure. Airports are third world type sometimes. People are living in cardboard boxes within sight of the White House, etc., etc. So we need to bring this issue also to the public, that they are paying a price every day for their countries possessing a nuclear weapon. Now, harking back to my comment about, in my view, the slow march to, hopefully we won't get there, to a nuclear war. In the past couple of years, we were bombarded with scenarios and videos that there would be a catalytic nuclear war that would start in South Asia. India and Pakistan would blow each other up. There would be a nuclear winter after 100 years, and all life would perish. But that hasn't happened. India and Pakistan have fought wars, but they haven't bombed each other's infrastructure. They haven't bombed each other's nuclear facilities. They have some guardrails in place, and I'm glad to see Dr. Rizwana Abbasi there at the back. She's from a federal university in Islamabad, but currently she's associated with the Central European University in Vienna, and I hope in the discussion she might wish to add some words about the perspectives from South Asia in this regard. So the concerns now are triggering a nuclear war in the heart of Europe, not in South Asia, not in the Korean Peninsula, and not in the Middle East. And here I find that the European Union now is becoming a dysfunctional actor, and apologies to Alexander and Thomas and George Wilhelm. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action did not survive the United States withdrawal. The European Union was not able to preserve one of its most significant foreign policy successes, and it is completely at sea what to do on this particular file. It is also completely at sea with regard to the war in Ukraine. And in the NPT review process last year, Poland, one of the new members of NATO, made this comment that the security of states should not be dependent on the well-being of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So as countries are beginning to question the value of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and put their security ahead of it, that their security is more important than whether or not the NPT survives or is implemented fully, then we are again on a dangerous precipice here. I also wanted to address what I refer to as some of the false narratives that are being now peddled in the context of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, for many years, I was a big supporter of the NPT, and I still am. So that doesn't mean that by pointing out some of these false narratives, I'm either sort of undermining the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but we need to address some of the shortfalls that are coming up right before us. So one has already been mentioned indirectly in the question and the response provided by Stephen, and that is nuclear forces stationed outside national territory of nuclear weapon states. So at the NPT review conferences now, it's generally the Netherlands, Italy, and Germany that take turns to say that NATO nuclear weapons have been seamlessly integrated and accepted into the NPT, and that they are not in any way in contravention, so to speak, of the spirit of the treaty. And this year,
Finland, and Sweden were asked to pay their dues, where they repeated this mantra, Sverre. But we need to understand, and also NATO has now put out some studies justifying that the NATO nuclear weapons have been grandfathered. So if we peel the pages of history back to 1967-68, when the Non-Proliferation Treaty was being negotiated in the 18-nation Disarmament Committee, at that time, both NATO and the Soviet Union had stationed nuclear forces in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. And so it was quite convenient for both of them to ensure that stationed nuclear weapons did not come under the ambit of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the withdrawal of stationed Soviet forces out of the former Warsaw Treaty Organization countries, the only weapons stationed outside of national territory are in the 5 NATO states. Now, fortunately, the non-aligned countries have begun to question this, although in the 18-nation Disarmament Committee, they were outnumbered by the Western countries. There were, I think, of the 18, only about 8 or so were non-aligned. So I'm glad that we have begun to question the viability of stationing nuclear weapons outside of national territory, and they are beginning to rankle the NATO members by saying that we now have another subcategory of states, those that have nuclear weapons on their territory or are sheltered under nuclear-armed alliances, and there is a lot of pushback that there is no third category in the NPT. It's only nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. Now, another false narrative that is being peddled is that the Non-Proliferation Treaty brings peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Now, it is correct that Article 4 of the NPT recognizes the inalienable right of all states to benefit from the peaceful uses. But peaceful uses of nuclear energy far predate the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Actually, the very statute and the functions of the IAEA are twofold. One is to foster cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and the second is to prevent its misuse for nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. And you might recall that some of the biggest conferences on peaceful uses were held in Geneva in the 80s, and one of the biggest conferences was this long-winded title, United Nations International Conference on the Peaceful Uses of Nuclear Energy in Kipuni, where more than 5,000 scientists attended. So today, there are nearly 1,300 technical cooperation and assistance projects of the IAEA in 150 countries. So to peddle this narrative that the peaceful uses of the NPT are not well known and we need to educate the Global South, this is basically a cover to distract the Global South from complaining about the non-fulfillment of the nuclear disarmament obligations by the nuclear weapon states and their allied states. So that's the second of the false narratives. Then the third one, as I alluded to in my comments with regard to the summit of the future, that nuclear disarmament can take place only in the context of general and complete disarmament. And then there are further riders in a way that promotes international security and stability and based on the principle of undiminished security for all. Now, I've discussed this with Alexander a couple of times, and he has also raised this issue in his comments in the review process. For us to get some definition, what is meant by principle of undiminished security for all, what is meant by disarmament in the context that promotes international stability from the possessors of nuclear weapons and those that benefit from them indirectly. So again, we need to have the pushback that in 2000 we made this important gain in the interpretation of Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, where, if you remember, in 2005 at the review conference, we lost 3 full days because some nuclear weapon states argued that there is no comma in the text of Article 6 between the good faith negotiations on disarmament and general and complete disarmament. So, again, we need to have a pushback that we can have nuclear disarmament, and general and complete disarmament is also a valid and feasible goal to achieve, but there is no symbiotic necessary relationship between the two. And 2 more points. And in this context, I also wanted to bring up this issue of verification. Now, verification
is done by the IAEA both for the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle and also for the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle. The big issue is verification of dismantlement of nuclear warheads. So in March, I was asked to go and speak to the Conference on Disarmament, and I pointed out to them that no nuclear weapon possessing country is willing to have international or bilateral or multilateral verification of dismantlement of nuclear warheads. Now, if we recall, more than 110,000 nuclear warheads have been manufactured since 1945. At the height, we had 70,000. Today, it's roughly 14,000. So what happened to all of these other warheads? Did they go off to Mars? Did they sink into the core of the Earth? No. They were dismantled quietly. And so that is the same process for us to follow. In my view, the South Africa model is a very viable model. And then you sequester the nuclear material coming out of dismantled warheads under IAEA verification and monitoring. No nuclear material, no nuclear warhead. And to ask for 100% confidence, we don't have 100% confidence in any form of our life or in any of our practices. So why should we seek an unachievable good here where the best becomes the enemy of the good? So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Well, now we have questions for Tariq or for any other panelists. So yes, Paolo first. Jan had raised his hand before. Okay. Yes. Paolo then.
Gender balance.
The comment on your talk.
No, but also you have gender balance.
No, it's that's okay. So Jan, please.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm tempted to address some of the points Tariq made, but I will resist the temptation and go back to my question which I have in my head. Because we are in Austria, I would like to briefly address the Bonn Treaty TPNW. As you probably all know, the Netherlands, as the only NATO country, joined the negotiations in 2016, but was not able to subscribe to the result. Some years later, in the first meeting of states parties, the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, and Norway were present as observers to the meeting. But I think that for the moment, as we speak about the prospects of nuclear weapon states and NATO allies to adhere to the TPNW, simply not in the stars for the coming years. What I would like to ask to all of you three is, would it be conceivable, in a better world, that there would be somehow some sort of link between the two treaties? I mean, they have both their communities, they have both their importance, the TPNW to acknowledge the humanitarian suffering and the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, the NPT by regulating somehow the spread of nuclear weapons. Would it be conceivable to make some sort of arrangement by combining the two treaties and their communities, for instance, by adding an horizon provision in the NPT, let's say that Article 6 should be implemented in 2040 at the latest. I mean, it's mind-boggling, but I see a lot of damage by these two treaties having a sort of hostile position towards each other. The only point of light I see is that all too hostile language has been avoided in the last 2 years when you look at the final declarations of both the NPT Review Conference and the TPNW, and there's some positive references, but there are still worlds apart between the two treaties, and that gives a lot of concern, I think.
Who would like to answer the question? Okay, so you say it, please. He will answer the question. Let's try to be short because I think there's a lot of interest, so please.
I will open my comments that I ran out of time. So thank you, Ambassador Hakima, for that. First of all, as I have written and others have pointed out, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is not self-implementing. Article 3 requires IAEA safeguards. Article 4 requires technical cooperation agreements. Article 7 requires nuclear weapons-free zone treaties. Article 6 requires various types of treaties like the Test Ban Treaty, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. So the TPNW is one type of treaty to seek the elimination of nuclear weapons. So in that sense, in my view, there is no contradiction. And nuclear weapons-free zone treaties are also prohibition treaties. So if they're not a contradiction, why is the TPNW a contradiction?
Now, a couple of years ago, in the so-called honesty meetings, which I started with more than 20 years ago, I mentioned to the British and the American ambassadors, why do you have to be so viscerally hostile to the TPNW? You can be, opposed to it, but still maintain habits of dialogue and civility. So fortunately, that is beginning to happen now. But the reason I brought this book of Alexander, that many of I'm sure you are not one of them, but many of the opponents have never read the TPNW. They have heard the criticism, they've heard it from their political masters or the alliance leaders, and they just salute of being loyal diplomats. So I'll stop there, and I think Alexander wants to chip in as well.
You want to chip in on this because then because then there are other questions. So please, Ambassador Kmentt.
Thanks a lot. I just wanted to have a comment to that question and categorically reject the notion that there is an antagonism between the two treaties. That is not true. All TPNW states parties are members of the NPT. All TPNW states parties and the treaty itself have made crystal clear the complementarity. The hostility comes from essentially the nuclear weapons states against the TPNW, and that has political reasons. It's nothing in the treaty that would justify that. The political reasons behind it is that, of course, the TPNW rejects nuclear weapons as such, rejects the notion of nuclear deterrence, which is something that, of course, the nuclear weapons states don't like. And the second aspect is that the TPNW came about through a process that the nuclear weapons states didn't like, didn't support, but couldn't stop. And everything related to nuclear weapons, from the perspective of the nuclear weapons states, is essentially an extension of the Security Council. Every treaty, including the NPT, operates on the basis of consensus, which makes sure that nothing ever happens that the nuclear weapons states don't like. So the fact that the non-nuclear weapons states were promoting a treaty against the position of the nuclear weapons states was absolutely unacceptable for those countries. So that explains the hostility. But there's nothing in the treaty, there's nothing ever anybody in the TPNW has said which would indicate that there is anything but the wish for complete complementarity between the two treaties. And as Tariq has said, it's actually logical because Article 6, the obligation on the disarmament in the treaty, is a couple of sentences. It doesn't say very much. It needs effective measures to implement it. And obviously, even logically, a prohibition, a legal prohibition of nuclear weapons is an effective measure to achieve nuclear disarmament. So you can make the argument, you can debate whether this is something that you agree first and then nuclear disarmament comes later, or whether nuclear disarmament has to come first and then when it's achieved, you come with the legal side. But conceptually, a prohibition is an effective measure to implement the NPT, Article 6, ergo there is full complementarity between the two treaties. I think absolutely crystal clear. I think it's just about time that the opponents of the TPNW sort of update their talking points a little bit, because as was said, for years now, TPNW state parties have made this point over and over again. And this is just an accusation that keeps being raised. It's actually not explained because it cannot be explained. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Please introduce yourself before asking the question. Before I give the floor to you, I think he has a short question that has to do with this topic, and then I'm going to give the floor to you. Thank you. Paolo, yes.
I've been reminded by Tariq that the number of nuclear weapons has decreased by a factor of 5 at least. Here's the top. Now we are all discussing about the increased risk of nuclear war. And there is a sense that the situation is getting worse. But the point is that the situation is getting worse not due to the fact that nuclear weapons are increased, not even to the fact that nuclear weapons are more sophisticated in terms of technological tools, I think one of the big factors which we are witnessing now is the political, military, economical relation between countries that possess nuclear. So if you look at the situation now in Ukraine, you have to realize that after the end of the Cold War, NATO extended enormously to the border of Russia. Russia felt that they've been always more and more constrained. Now, when NATO was, in a sense, threatening to extend also to Ukraine, that's something which created a big problem. So what I'm saying is that it's not to justify anything, but just that if one is a very important country with possess nuclear weapons, we have to be careful about dealing with the other countries that possess nuclear weapons. Since this is something that is very important, and the extension of NATO and the perception of encircling Russia has been one of the motivations for the Ukraine war. This is not to justify the Ukrainian war or Ukrainian invasion. It's not to justify. It's a matter of understanding how things can become worse. And if you look at the situation which is similar to Ukraine, think about Taiwan. We think that Taiwan, if someone the United States intervenes militarily in Taiwan, that's something which can create a similar problem between China and the United States. And we have to understand that big countries that possess nuclear weapons have the responsibility of dealing with each other in a way which is not increasing the reciprocal tension.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I think this, I take it as a comment because we are about to finish our session. So I would prefer to continue unless there is a strong feeling that someone wants to say something, but I would suggest that we continue because we're waiting for your comments. So please introduce yourself and
my name is Rizwan Abbasi. I'm a fellow at the Central Houston University. Let me congratulate you all for your highly enlightening, stimulating, and holistic presentations. We really enjoyed each bit of it. My comments are directed to Steve. I would like to say that Ukraine's inadequate self-defense definitely encouraged Russian incursion and full-scale invasion. But at the same time, Ukraine, after, of course, elimination of nuclear weapons from its territory, failed to receive or refused to introduce Ukraine under positive security assurances under U.S. extended deterrence. So why did we take so long? My further comment is that, of course, nuclear taboo is at the risk of breakdown. And with the passage of time, we observe and witness, war between Ukraine and Russia escalating, and widespread, counter-value attacks are being, observed. So global leadership also seems missing to cool the tempers down. So how confident are we that Russia, despite deploying, weapons in Belarus, is, not going to introduce nuclear weapons in the battlefield? So do we have any urgent plans to cool the tempers down and maybe step in to do something positive, making sure that nuclear weapons are not at any point introduced? Thank you.
Well, you've asked big, hard questions, and we have very little time. Ukraine was given security guarantees, and those security guarantees were violated. So the famous Budapest Memorandum was supposed to ensure Ukraine's sovereignty, and Russia was one of the guarantors of the Budapest Memorandum. And so this is an example that there's no agreement that can prevent a wanted war. Then the next question is, well, why didn't we do more to help Ukraine? And in fact, there is an argument that part of what galvanized Russia's concern about Ukraine was the substantial and growing level of security cooperation between NATO and Ukraine, which may be one of the reasons why Ukraine surprised the world in performing so well early in the war. My friend Bob Legwold has a nice line. He says, the problem was not Ukraine and NATO. The problem was NATO and Ukraine. because we had very extensive training missions. This is part of the so-called Partnership for Peace program and so on and so forth. But there were actually sensitivities, certainly in the United States, about extending full security guarantees deep into the former Soviet Union and to the border of Ukraine and Russia. And so there were people that were mindful of that. At the moment, you say rightly that we have an urgent situation and that we have to do what we can to calm it down, and I can't disagree with that observation. To my mind, the problem is that at the moment, neither Moscow nor Kyiv seems interested in a ceasefire. Neither of them wants to quit this war. And we have the very difficult situation for those who have sympathy for Ukraine, that it probably can't win, but it's just strong enough not to lose. And the result of that is a protracted conflict. And look back over the last 20 years. We were in Afghanistan for 2 decades. We were in Iraq for 12 years. How long was Russia in Chechnya? These things can drag on forever. And, when neither side has the incentive to quit, it's very difficult. Now, the joker in the pack here is that Ukraine is utterly dependent on supplies from outside. And so there is potential leverage to try and get Ukraine to be more interested in negotiation. But so far, no one has really been prepared to exercise that leverage, not least because Ukraine is the victim here, not the violence.
You want to say a word?
Yeah, Steve, if you talk to the people who negotiated the Budapest Memorandum, as you probably have, Ambassador Stephen Pfeiffer and others, they did not, unfortunately, want to give Ukraine a guarantee. What they merely repeated in the Budapest Memorandum was what was given in Security Council Resolution 255 and 984, positive and negative, and that they would meet to decide what to do while Ukraine could be attacked. And I remember in Canada, I was asked to host President Kuchma, another Canadian voice that's been silenced, that Jennifer knows about, the Canadian Center for Arms Control and Disarmament. He was sitting right next to me as Sverre is, and I was chairing the event, and he admitted that he didn't use the word hoodwinked, but he used the word something close to that. He said, we were bribed. The Clinton administration doubled the financial offer from $150 to about $300 million. We were so desperate. And yes, we would not have been able to maintain the missiles and the warheads, but we felt that we really were not given the assurance that we were seeking, that were we to face aggression from Russia, that we would really be defended, so to speak.
Thank you. I would like to acknowledge that we have started a few minutes late, so I really want to get your question as the last question, and then I think we are ready to continue our discussion in the reception. So please.
Thank you, Dr. Hallberg, for letting me squeeze in this very short and quick and easy question. But you saw I'm a researcher at the German Institute for International Security Affairs and also a member of International Students here in Pugwash. It's an honor to be in this room with all of you, and really great panel discussion so far and speeches before. Picking up on Steve Miller's nuclear geometry, I wanted to ask the panelists to what extent we can still think about or even envision compartmentalization. Difficult word for me, but encapsulating, so to speak, nuclear issues to at least talk about nuclear arms control in this kind of new geometry that we're in. Thank you.
People you like to reply to? Okay, final comment. Super.
Yes, very quick response. So, arms control is difficult. There's this famous line that arms control is an unnatural act. It's about negotiating, in many contexts, it's about negotiating your security with your adversary. Certainly bilateral arms control falls on that. So the circumstances that permit that are not common. and they require a harmonization of the internal circumstances of the two parties, if it's a bilateral negotiation, where you have what I call a game-winning coalition in favor of arms control in both governments simultaneously. And if you look at the U.S.-Iran relationship, there was regular disharmony when Washington was more interested in trying diplomacy, the Iranians weren't interested, and vice versa. And you had this brief period in the mid-2000s where you had a convergence of interest. But then, of course, it breaks down. And why does it break down? Because it's connected to all these other events. What about the missiles? What about the human rights? What about Iran's regional behavior? What about the support for terrorism? And the question is, how much can you buffer, especially nuclear arms control, from this wider canvas? And the answer is, when you can do it, it greatly facilitates arms control, but it's very difficult to do. But, for example, in 1972, the United States was mired in the Vietnam War. The principal supplier of the North Vietnamese was the Soviet Union. There were reports published in the New York Times that Soviet pilots were flying air combat missions over Indochina. And Nixon and Kissinger signed the SALT I agreement. And the reason is because they detached the nuclear question from the broader fabric of the competition. And the reason why they did that was complicated, and there were domestic calculations on both sides and so on. But part of it was there was an arms control community that made the argument that for a time was persuasive enough to permit arms control. And the argument was even the most hostile adversaries share a profound interest in avoiding an unwanted catastrophe that would befall both sides if you had an inadvertent nuclear war. Sorry? Well, now we did achieve it briefly with the JCPOA, where there was an argument that said.
We have to speak.
Yeah. Just one more thing. So there was an argument that said stopping Iran's nuclear program matters more than anything. Therefore, we should sequester that set of issues and address it. And all of our other troubles with Iran will be somewhat less worrisome if we've tapped their nuclear program, right? That was an argument about sequestration of the nuclear. But you can't ever prevent politics from seeping in, right? So American domestic politics takes over, and all of Obama's critics say that he's surrendering to the mullahs and so on. So it's a very messy, complicated process. But it is sometimes possible.
Thank you, Steve. Sverre, would you like to say some final words?
Let me use that invitation to talk about what Europeans could do on their own, or together, as it has to be, with the others in NATO. Reinforcing your point, Tariq, about nuclear weapons on the territories of others. I would strongly emphasize that the credibility of NATO's nuclear doctrine in Europe is next to zero. Compare for a moment the situation in the 1990s and the situation today. In the 1980s, NATO nuclear weapons could be used against Eastern Europe and against Soviet forces in Eastern Europe, if there was a clash between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Today, those nations in Eastern Europe, they are all in NATO. So what could be the target of NATO nuclear weapons in a war in Europe today? I have looked at, again, nuclear exercises, staff exercises in NATO, and there is only one possibility. Belarus. Belarus is still with Russia. All the others are in NATO, so you cannot possibly use nuclear weapons against your fellow NATO members and EU members. This is a logic that doesn't sort of go up. In other exercises, I've seen that instead of using nuclear weapons, NATO responds by conventional means. And that is indicative of what is now about to happen. Because there is a wave of long-range standoff weapons coming into Europe. They are all conventional. You might say that's the upside of it. The downside is, of course, that what is going on in NATO and also on the Russian side is the deployment of a range of new weapons that will invite early use of the weapons. So in that sense, the same problematic that we had in the 1980s. But as for eliminating nuclear weapons from the territories of others, I would strongly reinforce that by saying the doctrine that NATO has today is simply not credible.
Thank you. Well, I'll respond by saying all arms control agreements actually were a result of compartmentalization. They isolated the nuclear issue, the non-proliferation treaty, even the Helsinki agreements, they isolated the economic part, the human rights part, and the arms control part. But also, there needs to be good faith. So as was pointed out by Steve, the JCPOA was negotiated here in Vienna, but then when they translated it into Security Council Resolution 2231, the Iranians feel cheated because they're stuck in ballistic missiles, which they couldn't get here in Vienna on the table, and they also stuck in embargoes on conventional weapons. So already from the very beginning, you negotiate something and then you break trust immediately. So others are watching on this, North Korea is watching this. So we are making our own life more and more difficult. And third, the range of the airplanes in these 5 air forces can only reach the new members of NATO. They cannot go very far into the borders of Russia. So this was the joke during the time of the division of Germany. The more nuclear weapons in East and West Germany, the deader the Germans, because the range was so that only the Germans would be killed. And now, one of the reasons why I mentioned that the EU is becoming a disruptive actor, and some of you will not like this point, because some of the new East European countries, while they benefit from the economic cooperation and largesse from the European Union, on the military side there with the US, and some of them want to seek revenge on Russia, notably Poland, Czech Republic, and some of the Baltics. So they lose no opportunity in baiting the Russians, and the Russians at times should behave better, and they fall in the trap. So again, we need more sane voices. And small countries like Austria are coming under more and more pressure. Periodically, you hear that Austria is a freeloader. It really should join NATO. We are protecting Austria from the big bad bear, and they should give up the TPNW and, right into under the umbrella of NATO. I'm glad that Alexander and George Wilhelm and Thomas and other Austrians are firmly embedded in the neutrality, and I hope long may that live. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tariq. So I just want to wrap up, and I want to thank the Diplomatische Akademie again. I want to thank you, Ambassador Kmentt, and also all of you who have come here. But I want to emphasize that really I'm leaving here, but because we have to, at some time we have to finish, but we have so much to discuss. And I hope this is the first of many other open discussions we can have like this, and because we really need them. And we need this kind of open, candid discussions with experts like we had. So thank you very much again, and I hope we can continue.